Okay, so thanks for inviting me here today to talk to you about one of my favourite subjects, which is deleting information. I'm Susan Lamb. I was for many years a lawyer. Or I'm a lawyer in the UK, so a UK qualified lawyer, and I worked for Shell, the energy company, for 24 years as their SME on the retention and deletion of information and their records manager. And as part of my role during that time, I was the product owner for the Microsoft Purview, and I implemented comprehensive retention and deletion policies across the whole of the Microsoft suite of products, M365, SharePoint, Teams, email, OneDrive. And I'm going to tell you today, well, first of all, why I implemented deletion policies, and then tell you what we did, how we did it, and then share some sort of tips and tricks as to how I think what I learned from it, essentially. And let me just go on to my next slide then.
Susan, you're on mute now.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So one of the first things that I think we should cover is, why delete? Why isn't it good just to keep everything forever? And there are lots of reasons why not. So as my background really, as I mentioned, is from a legal perspective and from a compliance perspective, there is great need now to delete information, personal data that we no longer need to keep. I'm sure you are well familiar with the data privacy requirements, the GDPR, and it really requires us to make sure that we don't keep personal data overly long. And when I started doing this for Shell a few years ago, it was the GDPR was just coming into being. It hadn't been even implemented or signed across the European Union. And the culture about deletion and deleting information was really very not well understood. And people used to say to me, well, look, Susan, I've got emails from many years ago that I need to keep all the time. I need to refer to them. And there's lots of information that I've been keeping for many years that I'm often asked for. I'm often asked to show it as evidence in a court case or as needs for my business needs. And I always used to say to those people, look, this is not about getting rid of information that's valuable. It is very much about making sure that we keep the valuable information, the information that we can keep and we are allowed to keep from a compliance perspective. But there's many more types of information that we absolutely must get rid of when we don't need to keep it, because it clutters up our systems and it creates risk. It creates compliance risks, like I've mentioned, in terms of personal data, but also presents cybersecurity risk. And cybersecurity risk is ever present these days. I mean, I know it's one of Microsoft's priorities. It is Microsoft's priority to make sure that data is secure, and the threats to data getting into the wrong hands. And I always used to say to my stakeholders, if we do have a breach and information gets out into the public domain, that's very unfortunate, and we mustn't do everything to make sure that doesn't happen. But it's really even worse if that information, we shouldn't be keeping, and we're keeping it, and it actually harms us. So there's a real cybersecurity risk to be addressed in terms of deleting information as well. And then from a legal perspective, the litigation risk is also there. So we talk about in the legal world about things called smoking guns. I don't know if you've heard of those, so let me explain a little bit. So when a regulator or a third party is subject to litigation, or a regulator comes in to investigate perhaps anti-competitive behaviour or something to do with legal compliance, they can ask to see all the information that you've got, the company has, relating to that particular, whatever the issue is. And the company then is obliged to disclose all that information. It's called discovery, and everything that it's got, not just everything that is good and that tells a good story in respect to the company, but anything that isn't particularly helpful as well. Those all has to be disclosed. And that's what we call smoking guns. They're those pieces of information that sit there in the just being stored, never being used or looked at, and actually don't need to be kept. Either their retention period, their legal retention period has expired, or they're sorts of things that actually we probably weren't very helpful in the first place. And so we really need to make sure that we don't keep those that end up being harmful to the company. And going back to my stakeholders who used to say to me, "Oh gosh, Susan, well, I've had people come to me when we've had a regulatory investigation, and I've had to disclose all my information, and I've found a piece of information that's actually helped the company, and I've saved the day." And I personally call those our information heroes, and they absolutely have done a good thing in keeping their information, of course. However, the number of times that that happens, and that is a good thing, is far less than the number of times when the information, as I said, has to be disclosed. It's actually harmful. And my colleagues in who do these regulatory investigations, the lawyers I used to deal with, my colleagues used to say to me, it's about 10 to 1. Every time we get information from people, and 10 times it will harm us, compared to one time when there'll be a gem that will actually save the day. So it's a risk-based management here of compliance and litigation. And you can see from the slides, we do keep a lot of information that we just isn't helpful, redundant, obsolete, or trivial. Well, I think we all know that's what it's called. And a recent study showed by the Compliance and Governance Oversight Council that actually about 68% of what we've got is essentially redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And 5% is subject to regulatory legal record keeping, of course, and we absolutely need to do that. And then, of course, you've got business value information that we need to keep as well. But if you are storing information forever and not deleting, then, as I say, it's definitely creating compliance risk, cybersecurity risk, but also now, of course, increased costs of storage, and the costs of storage are ever rising. And it's not going to ever go down in that sense. And keeping information that we need to we don't need to keep is creating more storage that we don't need. And e-discovery is that process that I've referred to in terms of legal regulatory investigations, not just the smoking gun issue, as I mentioned, but also when you have a regulatory investigation and you have to find that information that is valuable or not, as a case may be, then having to trawl through and find it through lots of information that is actually redundant, obsolete, or trivial also creates extra costs and resources when the time comes to that. And being able to find information as well, the more information that you got to search through that you don't need. And finally, now we're in the world of AI, and it's great that I've got to nearly 10 minutes into the presentation and only just mentioning AI, because of course we're all thinking about AI and how we need to use it for our businesses and get better value out of it for our businesses. And we all know, of course, that the AI depends on data, and good quality, high quality data. It does not depend. It is not a good thing to have lots of redundant, obsolete, or trivial information in our workspaces that, say, Copilot is then being it can use to give responses to. And so high quality information that is business valuable information that is needed to keep kept for regulatory reasons, that's the information that you need to keep to be able to have trustworthy and reliable AI results from things like Copilot. So I've got on my little hobby horse now about why deleting is so important.
Susan, you went on mute again.
I don't know why it's doing that. Sorry, every time I move my mouse, it seems to do that anyway. Shell, so just to explain, make sure everybody's heard of Shell. I'm sure you have. It's a large energy company. It's present in about 80 different countries and has in the region of about 120,000 staff made up of employees and contractors. And it's a Microsoft house and has implemented Microsoft 365 across the whole of its landscape, and in the region of about 10,000 SharePoint sites. And just to keep it in perspective, we have in terms of deleting billions of emails and billions of documents, 30 billion emails deleted and rising as a result of implementing data lifecycle management at Shell. So I think, you know, I want to share this story with you, A, because it demonstrates, I'm proud of it, but B, because it demonstrates that it can be done. It does show that it is possible to implement comprehensive retention and deletion policies. And of course, Shell is a big company, and I know you people, the people on this call are not in such big organizations as Shell, but it shows that if it can be done in such a big, complex organization, it is possible to do it for a smaller organization. And at Infotection, and where I am the principal data governance SME, we've got lots of examples where we've implemented it for much smaller companies than Shell, but using similar principles and being able to provide much more quick start solutions based on the experience that we've learned during this case study. Because Infotection partnered with Shell and myself during this journey to implement data lifecycle management at Shell. And so I want you to really bear that in mind, that yes, this is a big global energy company, but it's equally applicable to smaller companies. In fact, much more doable for smaller companies and over a much shorter timeline due to lots of different things that have come, and I'll come on to that in a minute, how we can improve things going forward as well. So it started off with a migration of the old EDRM solution that Shell had. And actually, they had a record management solution in place as well at that time called HP Trim. They had implemented that in response to some legal and regulatory requirements to keep their records, get their records in order, very important from the regulatory authorities in the States, in the US. But it was very clunky. It was not easy, user-friendly for users to use, to put records in there. And we actually started working with Microsoft to develop functionality in their suite of products, which is now called Data Lifecycle Management and Purview. It wasn't then at that time. But it was about looking to the future for the vision about how an organization that can manage its information, use its information, i.e. for its business. That's at the end of the day, that's what we're all doing, is running a business. We're not doing information management for the sake of it. It has to be business friendly. And in that sense, to have information that's valuable, that is able to be kept in the same place as and retained for the right length of time, and be able to then delete what they don't need to keep. So if you can see it, the slogan at the bottom is what we were aiming for, which is to keep what you need, protect it, and delete the rest. And when we started this, as I say, we started looking at this and working with Microsoft and Infotection very before Purview was even around. And the vision was to be able to help people identify and keep what they need to keep, and then implement auto deletion policies to delete the rest. And it was very much driven by the need to be compliant with GDPR, which I said was just coming into force at that time. And however, now I think it was very much a compliance story for Shell. but it's much more a value story now, I think, for people who are facing this challenge, and that's around AI. Being able to demonstrate that you've got a good, high quality set of data that is got the information that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial being deleted, then that's the story that if I was doing this again for a company, I would that would be my business case rather than from a compliance perspective. Although, of course, because compliance isn't sexy, people don't wake up and get excited about being compliant, but they are very excited about AI. And so I would definitely shift the narrative if I was to do this again, and use that as my lever, if you like, to get business buy-in for this. So, well, first thing we did in Shell was simplify our retention schedule. So this is basically a high-level list of the types of information that is valuable to Shell, and that's what Shell called their records. And at that time, they had a very complex retention schedule. It was about 5,000 different types of information, very granular, and it was never going to work in a simplified IT system that would be user friendly for people. And so we simplified the group retention schedule and went from 5,000 to about 120 different classes of retention periods for records. And we did that first because we were actually working with Microsoft at that time and helping shape the functionality. And we could see that 5,000, so a system that could deal with 5,000 different options was never going to really be sustainable. And also, one of the big principles here that we adopted was that if you're going to ask people, if you're going to do some automatic deletion, and that was definitely, as I say, the driver, you need to be able to very easily keep the information that you do need, because otherwise you have this the pendulum will swing the wrong way. And actually, I was talking to a company last week about this, and they implemented auto deletion policies without actually implementing the retention side and giving users the ability to keep their valuable information easily in a user-friendly way first. So we absolutely looked at our retention schedule and simplified that. And then we implemented that in SharePoint first. And so we equipped the SharePoint sites, moved to SharePoint Online, and applied retention labels in SharePoint to all the information that we needed to keep and that was valuable. And that was a manual process for Shell at the time, because the reason that this timeline is longer than it would be now is because the functionality was evolving at the same time as Shell were rolling it out. As I said, I was leading the program and working with Infotection and Microsoft. And actually, Shell, as a big customer, were pushing Microsoft to provide the functionality as quickly as possible. And it would be a different story now. For a start, we would have benefits of auto labeling, content analytics to identify records, and then be able to auto label. None of that automatic functionality was available at the time, and so that is definitely something we would do differently this time and would make it a lot easier. So once we'd done records management and implemented the retention labels in SharePoint, we then implemented the what we call our non-records. So anything that, if you think about it, the redundant, obsolete, and trivial information I talked about earlier, we then implemented a policy to auto delete that in SharePoint. We'd retain the information that we needed that was safe, and then we could implement the auto deletion at the same time. And as I said, some stakeholders were quite difficult and quite reluctant and worried about this. But it was a question of making sure that they understood the reason, which was a compliance driver, but also helping them do what they needed to do to keep the information they need to keep. It was never about deleting valuable information. This is really about getting that information that is no longer needed out of the system. So then, and we started by developing a set of principles around the type of information that we wanted to keep and where we wanted to keep it. So another thing that we created a set of principles, and one of the principles, as I said, was that we would only implement an auto deletion policy where once we've given and had the opportunity to protect information we needed to keep, so that valuable information, because that's absolutely paramount. But the second one, and there were a few, I'm not going to tell you them all because I haven't got time, but the second one was as to where do we keep our valuable information. So we decided that valuable information, i.e. records or information that we retain long term, has to be kept in a shared space, such as a SharePoint site. So not in the personal space like someone's OneDrive or someone's email. And so any information that is valuable is put into a SharePoint site. And then with that principle in mind, we moved on to implementing our non-record disposal, our auto deletion policy for, as I say, our redundant, obsolete or trivial information into people's OneDrive. And we gave users a chance to look through their OneDrives and identify anything that was valuable and move it to a SharePoint site. And then we implemented the non-record deletion policy. And then we did the same for Exchange Online for emails. Very quickly, easy to say. Obviously, that took the email bit was probably the most challenging. And we purposely left that to the end because we started with what we saw as the easiest part, which was the SharePoint Online part, because those are shared spaces and people are less emotionally attached to the stuff, the content in SharePoint, but very, very much more emotionally attached to things in their OneDrive. And of course, email. And actually, email, I think, is one of the biggest risks because there's lots of emails that people keep and from going back years. And so one example, for example, that we used as a bit of a sort of campaign was that when you have appraisals and you give company appraisals, there's often a feedback process where you get feedback from maybe people who've worked with people, and that all inputs into the overall appraisal for that person. Line managers said to me, well, I've got feedback on people going back, say, 10 years. And I've kept that, and I think I should be keeping that because it's important. And actually, it's absolutely not, and actually not acceptable to keep that kind of personal data on performance data way longer than the actual moment with which it's being used. So, for example, that in 10 years' time, some of those people in that team had left the company, but that line manager still had emails that related to their performance, which is absolutely not allowable under the GDPR. So there were some really good examples of that where we used them to help people understand and make it personal to them. And how would you feel if your company had still had your personal data and you left, say, 5 years ago or whatever? So it was about educating the users on the benefits, and then but also giving them the ability to keep the information that they thought was valuable as well. And then we moved around to implement non-record disposal on Teams. Now, again, I'll probably do this differently now because actually it might seem, where did you start? Why didn't you start with Teams? Because that's what everyone uses these days. Well, actually, funnily enough, Teams was only just starting to be rolled out properly. I mean, COVID, I think, was the big flurry of people starting to use Teams, and that was definitely the case in Shell. We didn't really have Teams before that. So, as I say, I keep saying this story is very much an evolution of how it happened for Shell, and it wouldn't necessarily happen the same way now. It is because of way the functionality evolved through the thought leadership of Shell and other customers, and with our the partners that we use in protection at the time. And then finally, just on this part, again, sensitivity labeling is the last part of this story from the Shell perspective. However, now it's probably one of the first areas that people choose to address because of what I mentioned before, that cybersecurity risk that we are all facing. And actually, it's something it's something that from a risk perspective, that's what companies want to address. But we did it differently because, as I say, at the end, it wasn't until at the end of the DLM journey that actually sensitivity labeling functionality came into Microsoft Purview. So that's the whole in terms of the story end to end. And as I say, it was very much driven by the evolution of the functionality, and that drove to some extent. This was a several-year journey for Shell. However, I do think, and I've seen it done. I'll come on to give you some examples of where we've done it in protection much quicker. And this obviously has to be done quicker. I mean, we need to do this in terms of less user impact and get the benefits as quickly as possible. And we have templates and other things that we can use in protection to do that in as little as 2 months. I'll come on and share you a specific example of that later on. So, sorry, my thing's covering me up here. I just moved this over. So just in terms of the achievements, this slide is way out of date, obviously now, but as I actually left Shell near the end of last year, and I've been within protection since then, and the numbers for the deletion numbers have well risen past these numbers now, but they're still pretty impressive. 3 billion non-records disposed, and ever rising, and I think. The experience, and people say, people said to me, gosh, Susan, this what's going to happen when you switch on these policies? And actually nothing actually happened. The world didn't end, and there were some instances where people perhaps hadn't taken all the action to label their information and keep it. But it was very easy to remedy that and move it out of the recycle bin. We did have a few instances of that. I don't want you to think that it was completely as easy as anything. But I think learning from what we did, I think the main thing was to really explain to people why the deletion imperative, but also now with the benefit of the functionality that we have in Purview around automation and auto classification, trainable classifiers, and all those sorts of things, that risk can really be managed much better than we were able to at the time. See, I caught it then. Didn't catch me out then. So just in terms of some of the principles that we adopted in this journey, as I said, we absolutely thought that a record or piece of information, so a record was defined as anything you need to keep for legal reasons, compliance reasons. Obviously, I think we all know we have to comply with those, but then anything that's valuable to the business. And that was another thing in this. Some people said to me, oh gosh, well, I need to keep this information, but it's not a record. And I say, well, look, we absolutely keep everything we need to keep for the business. And if it need to keep it for the business, then it is a record. But none of those not valuable information should be kept in personal spaces. As I say, I know your companies are not as big as Shell. However, in many organizations, people move businesses, but people move roles, they move through different departments. And valuable information shouldn't really go with them in their OneDrives. It should be available for whoever comes to in their role afterwards, or whoever personal team areas where that knowledge and that valuable knowledge can be retained, and then, as I say, eventually used not just for people to access, but also obviously Copilot. Because obviously personal spaces and Copilot respecting all the access controls around that's taking valuable information out of the benefit of everybody in the company to use it. I mean, obviously, shared spaces have to have proper access controls. You can't also, or depending on the type of information. But if it's just personal in person's OneDrive, then that's a much more limited situation than if it's in a shared space with limited access because of its sensitivity. So records only in shared collections, I think I've covered that. And then another thing about this was that you've seen the journey that we went on. And the principle was that people are very clever, and people, if you don't have a comprehensive policy that you move through, not necessarily, definitely not doing it all at once, but you take people on that journey, um, uh, it, it's it stops that a mentality of, well, I'll just move it somewhere else. We had a lot of people saying, well, if you're not going to let me keep it on OneDrive, I'll put it on my I'll put it in my hard drives, or I'll share it on, I'll keep it on my local drive or whatever. And actually, after we'd done everything in Microsoft 365, there was another program which went through looking at all the shared drives and making sure that that was all cleaned up as well. And I could do another presentation on that for you if you'd like to hear about that. But that was absolutely the principle being that, eventually you have to do, and I don't want to use the word lockdown, but you just have to be, this has to be pervasive. Otherwise, people will find little places to squirrel away their information that is not subject to the policies in the, and that's again probably created even more risk. And then just e-discovery. I know I probably need to talk. This would be much more relevant for a common law country like the UK or the States, where e-discovery is a big deal. But just to be clear that there is preservation, there is hold functionality in the Purview product, that if information is required for an investigation, a regulatory investigation, then that functionality allows a hold to be placed on the information that actually supersedes any default deletion policy. Because, as I say, there are people that will say, I need to keep this information because it's preserved for a regulatory investigation. And in those situations, that's absolutely legitimate, and that's where Purview e-discovery whole functionality can assist. Right, I'm going to do that again, and I think it's going to. Oh, didn't put me on mute. Okay. So this is just an example of some of the communication type approaches that we use to help stakeholders move through this journey. And it was really important for us to make sure that it was really simple for people. And keeping it simple, making sure the user interface was very simple. So, for example, talking about going back to the journey with the Microsoft functionality, implementing the retention labeling in, say, SharePoint was very much intended to implement it very simply. So, for example, for a start, as we said, we simplified the group retention schedule, so there was very few options for people to have to choose in terms of a retention period and retention label. But then we also worked with Microsoft to shape what is now called the I think auto labeling or default labeling functionality, where libraries or folders can have a retention label applied or a label policy applied, and then users can just save their information into that place, and it gets that information's retention, that folder's retention policy. So actually, it's about, they just put the information in the right place, and then it's retained for as long as it needs to be retained. And if you can set the SharePoint sites up as or just do that going forward, encourage people to use it in a going forward way, then it really helps take that burden off people in terms of having to choose retention labels and things. And again, as I say, you've got much more automation that you can do now anyway. But these are good examples of three golden rules that we established. And I've talked through these really. First of all is store information in the right place. Talked about that. And then label information correctly. So that's about applying a retention label. And it was about apply the retention label, because if you do that, then the system will get rid of everything you don't need automatically. It will do that for you. And then the third thing, which is slightly more information management driven, about storage, which is asking users not to share attachments, but to share links, obviously accessible, shareable links, so that they don't create multiple copies of documents. So this was like, we had 3 golden rules, and we had like a little laptop stickers that people could put on their laptops to remind them to do the right thing with their information. That's just an example of the way we approached it. So as I say, there will be the journey that Shell went on is almost like sort of the longest and one of the most more complex journeys. And so in a way, in that sense, it absolutely shows that even in those sorts of environments, it can be done. But now there are so many more improvements that can be implemented and used in Purview to achieve the same thing, and not have to do such a dramatic program as was done in Shell. And there's lots of information type identification through different automated functionality in Purview, and auto labeling, for example, of sensitive information. And as I said before, have records based on storage location and content using default labels. I mentioned those. We absolutely use those, but also things like sensitive information types and trainable classifiers, which involve machine learnings. And there are some of these out of the box already from Microsoft that you can use, but they can also have custom trainable classifiers that that can be used if out of the box ones don't work particularly for your information. But I mean, I'm not going to go into this in detail because it's all very technical, and this is definitely a non-technical discussion presentation, because I'm not a technical person. But I think, this is another example, a really good example of how the journey is supported much more now by functionality in Purview that's available and ready to be used. So I said I'd sort of come on to help you in terms of a better, more realistic example, or maybe another example on the other side of the spectrum, in terms of this company that was an implementation in only 2 months. Much smaller, a manufacturer of 7,000 employees, but equally over quite a large footprint of countries. And this is an example of a case study that Infotection implemented. So I've kind of gone from one extreme to another, because, as I said in the beginning, the learnings from the Shell case story have been able to be packaged up into things that we can use and help companies get much quicker and faster started. So, for example, using the templated approach and looking at particular risk areas, it's possible to implement this relatively quickly. This is, as I say, a company it took 2 months, and with the right mindset, and with that whole kind of being able to take the benefits and learnings from what we've done with other customers, it's very easy to get going without a huge program. And I think this is something that we do in Infotection in the region of about 75,000 euros, and but could be could be cheaper for a smaller company. So I definitely want you to kind of get the impression that it's absolutely doable, because we have the benefit of having done it in a bigger company, and all that complexity, and now can boil it down into a much more off-the-shelf approach. Yeah, so another things you can do to get started, doing an assessment. to look at where particular risks and costs and what the costs would be is one option that we can absolutely help you with. The retention schedule, I mean, that's something that I think a lot of people do wrestle with and find challenging, because there's this feeling that it has to be very granular, especially when it comes to things like dealing with the GDPR. But actually, as I said, it is possible to have what we call a big bucket approach. And it's at the end of the day about making it really simple for end users to be able to identify what the information is. So, for example, if it's a investment proposal, then investment proposals go in this place in SharePoint in a shared space, and it's automatically tagged, and they don't need to do anything. They don't actually need to know how long the company keeps investment proposals. They just need to know where to put it. Essentially, that's very, very doable now in the functionality. And then also can look at all the auto labeling options and perhaps run a POC.